guys, it's Mr. Myra, and today we're going to be talking about the Pacific Theater of World War II, and specifically the United States and Japan's involvement.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Now, when we talk about the Pacific Theater, we have to back up a little bit and look at what Japan was doing in the 1930s and early into the 1940s. Japan had taken control of large chunks of China. They had also taken control of parts of Korea and the islands of the Philippines and what was called Indochina at the time. Indochina today is modern-day Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And the British were very fearful that eventually the Japanese were going to go all the way down into Australia and completely control the South Pacific.
And security to my new empire.
Your new empire?
So while the Japanese were not necessarily on the exact same level as the Nazis, they were not without their horrific humanitarian war crimes that they committed. One of the most infamous war crimes committed by the Japanese was the rape of Nanking. This took place in China, and over 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war were targeted by this brutal slaughter and also rape of civilians in the city of Nanking. Another terrible thing that the Japanese did was what was known as the Bataan Death March. The Bataan Death March killed over 20,000 Filipino civilians and soldiers, anybody who had gotten swept up in the way of the Japanese empire, and at least 1,600 U.S. prisoners of war. They were marched 66 miles through hot tropical island jungle, and many of them died along the way due to malnutrition, dehydration, and exhaustion and exposure to the elements. Another atrocity committed by the Japanese was what was known as the Burma Railway Construction Massacre or die-off. So what happened here was that in what is today modern-day Myanmar, what was then called Burma, the Japanese were building a railroad across the country in order to move supplies. And they weren't using their own workers, they were using essentially what was slave labor. But slave labor that consisted of prisoners of war and Malayans. About 80,000 Malayans will be killed, another 13,000 Allied POWs will be killed. And this is not just US POWs, this includes prisoners of war from other Allied nations such as Britain. Alrighty, so before we get to the war proper, we also need to know some terms here. So our first term today is carrier. Now, there are two types of carriers. The first carrier is the one that we are probably most familiar with when we talk about the Navy, and that is an aircraft carrier. An aircraft carrier does just that. It carries planes and such to be launched off of the flight deck. If you've ever seen Top Gun, you've seen an aircraft carrier in action. The other type of carrier is what is called an escort carrier. Aircraft carriers themselves are crucial to winning the war. The US and the Japanese will both employ them in the Pacific. The bulk of our aircraft carriers were made in the Philadelphia and Camden shipyards, which is pretty cool for any of you who are from around that area. Aircraft carriers were about 1,000 feet long. Some of them could carry upwards of 100 planes, if not more, and they usually employed about 3,000 to 4,500 personnel. So this aircraft carrier wasn't just a boat, it's an entire floating town ready to make war wherever we have to deploy this. And in the Pacific, we deployed about 3 aircraft carriers at the start of the war. In total, our Navy consisted of 9 battleships, and this is in the Pacific, 9 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, 12 heavy cruisers, 8 light cruisers, 50 destroyer battleships, 33 submarines, and about 100 patrol bomber aircraft that escorted our boats across the Pacific as we went and took islands and worked our way towards Japan.
Now that's a lot of damage!
Alrighty, it's now time for the fun facts segment of the show, and this week what we're going to be looking at are actually three different things. The first one is the famed kamikaze. When we think of kamikazes, again, we think of media and cinema, where these planes just come flying down and crash and cause all this decimation to Allied forces in the Pacific. In reality, though, kamikazes usually weren't that effective. They were slower, older aircraft that were piloted by inexperienced airmen, and they were loaded up with explosives, and they were actually usually relatively easy targets for U.S. battleships to shoot down with flak guns or whatever it was, anti-aircraft guns that was firing at these kamikazes. However, occasionally they would strike pay dirt, and they would cause mass decimation, because you got to think about it. This is the first guided missile. Sadly, it's guided by a human being, but there was no such thing as a guided missile in our arsenal in World War II. And the kamikazes that did hit were able to cause mass devastation to U.S. battleships or other sorts of naval ships. Kamikazes were a desperate measure taken as the United States and Allied forces got closer to the Japanese mainland.
Hey, wait a minute, fellas. KDR, en route to... How are you? I'm fine, thanks. How are you? Wait a minute, you wanna...
Fun fact number 2. There were some Japanese fighters from either their Army or their Navy or their Air Force
Well done! Well done!
that had gotten marooned on islands in the Pacific in World War II, and many of them either didn't get the memo or didn't believe it when they were told, but they actually didn't surrender when Japan surrendered in 1945. These guys would pop up throughout the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s, and some even into the late 1970s, where they still thought World War II was happening. There's a famous case of a man called Lieutenant Hiro Onada, who was in the Philippines, and it's not until 1974 that he surrenders. He was kind of known as this crazy old hermit in the hills who would harass fishermen or anybody who tried to get near him. And eventually they figured it out that he was actually a marooned Japanese soldier. And they had to go back to Japan, dig out his commanding officer from a nursing home, and fly that guy out to this island to tell Lieutenant Hiro Onada that, hey man, the war ended about 30 years ago. You can give up. And then he does actually finally surrender, and he will live until 2014. Fun fact number 3. What a lot of people don't know is that Alaska was actually home to several battles of the Pacific Ocean. There's a chain of islands off of Alaska called the Aleutian Islands, and 2 of these are Attu and Kiska, and these 2 islands were actually occupied by the Japanese. And so what happens is the Allies sail up there, and we lay down a 3-week artillery barrage to these 2 islands, and go and invade with a full invasion force, and then we realized that the Japanese had actually packed up about a week into it and left. The reason Alaska is actually geographically significant to the war is because once you set up a base there, you can launch attacks down into Japan. And Japan wanted Alaska because they could then set up bases and launch attacks down into places like Washington, Oregon, and California, the west coast of the United States. I almost forgot my coffee. There we go. When Pearl Harbor happens, fortunately, all 3 of our aircraft carriers that were actually anchored there were out on different errands and missions, and none of them were hit. So while the Japanese thought they were going to cripple us, they didn't realize that our aircraft carriers were not there. Pearl Harbor will take place in December 7th of 1941, and as FDR says, it is a day that shall live in infamy.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
23,000 Americans will die in this attack by the Japanese, and it was a surprise attack. The reason we didn't see them coming was because radar was in its infancy, and there was a radar listening post that was deployed on the Hawaiian Islands. However, it was kind of seen as an experimental, quirky technology, and they hadn't really figured out how to really use it effectively yet, and Japanese planes were actually picked up coming in, And the man at the radar station radioed this back to command, and they said, "Oh, it's probably something with the technology. It's probably a faulty readout. Ignore it." And then lo and behold, we get attacked by the Japanese. So many historians and kids and students will say, "Hey, why did the Japanese even attack us in the first place?" Well, we had been negotiating with them, but once they had signed an alliance with the Nazis, we had started to cut off their supplies. And being an island nation, they need to go out and get stuff because they can't get all the resources that they need in order to fight a war on the Japanese mainland. They have to go out and take over other places to do it. So they thought that if they were able to cripple the United States early in a preemptive strike, they could eventually sue for peace and keep these islands that they had taken. Because they knew that if they did not strike at the United States, at some point we would come into the war. And because they were allied with Nazi Germany, they would then be an enemy of us because we had allied ourselves with Britain and France. There's an amazing movie called Tora 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 that is really old. I forget if it came out in the 70s, late 70s, maybe early 80s, about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And there's a scene in there after the attack where all of the generals are celebrating, except for one man. And that Japanese admiral's name is Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He's the head of the Japanese fleet, one of the heads of the Japanese fleet, and he famously says, "Within this attack, we have awakened a sleeping giant." Basically, this preemptive strike isn't going to do anything except make the Americans angry, and they're going to come after us. He had, before the attack had actually happened, he had warned against it and said this is a bad idea, because as soon as we attack the Americans, they're going to get involved in the Pacific, and then they're going to fight and eventually win against us. There's no way we can beat America. Because if you look at the statistics, America is literally most of an entire continent. Japan is a small island nation. America has all the resources it needs to fight its wars abroad, at home, and the Japanese have to go out and get their resources. So they're going to be fighting an uphill battle once we really mobilize for a total war economy. The United States strategy in the Pacific is something called island hopping. The Japanese had been digging into islands throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s and setting up airfields and all sorts of artillery so that in the event the United States did actually attack, they would be able to fight. So we said, forget it, we're going to skip all those islands, we're going to go to the deserted islands and we'll set up air bases there and we'll attack from there and eventually we'll push the Japanese back that way. And it actually worked for us. It took a while. We start fighting in 1941 and we don't get to Okinawa until 1945. But eventually we do win with this strategy of island hopping. Now if you look at a map of the Japanese Empire, you can see before 1942 it's pretty big. However, the high water mark of the Japanese Empire is at the island of Midway. Some historians would say that if the Japanese had won at the Battle of Midway in 1942, they would have eventually been able to take Hawaii because you can see that they're pretty much next door neighbors. And then after that, there's nothing between Hawaii and San Francisco of strategic military value. And if they had taken Hawaii, they then would have been able to essentially sue for peace in the Pacific. The other major battle in 1942, there are hundreds of battles that happened, but the other major one in 1942 is the Battle of Coral Sea. The Battle of Coral Sea involved the United States sending an aircraft carrier group down to the South Pacific in order to defend the mainland of Australia from being invaded by the Japanese. We pushed them back here, and because of that, they are never able to go on and conquer Australia. The other interesting fact about this battle is that our boats never actually saw each other. The United States and the Japanese will both launch aircraft from carriers. These aircraft will meet in the middle of the ocean, duke it out and fight. The United States will win, and the remaining planes fly home. We never actually see their ships. And again, this just details the importance of aircraft carriers in World War II. So by 1945, we have island hopped our way all the way to the Japanese home islands. One of the most significant battles that happened here is the Battle of Iwo Jima. That's that one. The one that you always see the picture of, the man hoisting the flag victoriously. A fun fact about this picture was that it was actually just kind of an impromptu thing. They had already raised the flag once, and the photographer said, "Wait, I missed it. Pull it back down and put it back up." And that shot goes global and becomes one of the most iconic pictures of World War II. However, the battle itself includes an amphibious landing with battleships parked out around the island, laying down an artillery barrage, and 21,000 Japanese will be defending this island. Almost all 21,000 of the Japanese who are defending this island die. Not because we kill them all, because many of them commit ritual suicide, because the Japanese thought it was better to kill yourself than be taken prisoner of war by the enemy forces. So after we had taken Iwo Jima, Okinawa was our next target. Okinawa is strategically significant because it is less than 320 miles from the Japanese mainland. That's an easy flight for bomber and other aircraft groups to go over and invade or drop bombs on the Japanese mainland. However, this island is not easily won. It takes 82 days and the largest amphibious landing in the Pacific in order to finally take the island. Like I said, the Japanese would fight to the last bullet. They would not surrender. Being a prisoner of war was a worse sentence than dying, so many of them would just kill themselves or keep fighting until they were shot or incapacitated. But after 82 days, we take the island of Okinawa, and this allows us a strategic launching point to launch bomber groups over the mainland islands of Japan. So we're now faced with a conundrum. Estimates showed that if the Japanese soldiers who were stationed on the main islands of Japan, as well as some of the civilians who were probably able to fight, actually did fight us if we were to invade the mainland of Japan, it would potentially cost us up to 8 million casualties, which was a statistic that was just too high for a lot of people in the Allied command. However, we had been working in secret since 1939 on the atomic bomb in something called the Manhattan Project. And the atomic bomb was and is a destructive device unlike anything you've ever seen. Using a modified B-29 Boeing Super Fortress, we will drop Fat Man and Little Boy, these are the code names for the atomic bombs, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In total, about 230,000 people-ish will die. That figure is kind of blurry because we don't know how many people died of the actual blast and ensuing fallout and radiation versus how many people were trapped by falling buildings or died of dehydration and exposure after the cities have been leveled. But either way, close to about 200,000 people died as a result of the atomic bombs. Japan will surrender. Emperor Hirohito will sign the surrender September 2nd, 1945, and that will end the war in the Pacific. Alright guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Stay tuned for our next segment, and as always, keep on keeping on.